Hi, guys. So this will be our first meeting of our virtual classroom, which we'll maintain for the rest of the semester. I decided to skip over the Adrian Rich poem. We'll see if we have time, maybe towards the end of the semester, and we'll circle back to it. It's a terrific poem, and I think you'll enjoy reading it. But I want to make sure this week that we have enough time to talk about Zora Neale Hurston's short story Sweat. It's a story that students typically like a great deal, and it's one that many students choose to write their final papers on. So I want to make sure that we have enough time to discuss it in a little bit of detail. As I mentioned in the email, the way we're going to work is I will post these videos. They'll be available to you by YouTube. I'll send you the links and put the links on our Facebook page. You'll watch them before we meet for our virtual class, which will be during our regular class time on a discussion board through Blackboard. We'll have a chance during that time to discuss the story together more fully, and then when that's all over, I will post some follow-up ideas so I can make sure that you have all the essential information that you need. When we're thinking about Sweat, I want us to think about this as a story that will draw together a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about in other works. It's a story that has a lot to tell us about issues of gender. It has a lot to tell us about relationships between individuals and the communities in which they live. And of course, as you'll notice as you're reading through it, it has a lot to do with race as well. The story takes place, we should imagine, I think, right around the time that it was published, which is 1926. Like a lot of Zora Neale Hurston's fiction, in fact, I think all of her fiction, it's set in rural Florida. You would recognize one of the towns that's mentioned, Kissimmee, which is near Orlando. It's one of the places that people stay when they go to see the Orlando attractions. At the time that the story was written, though, that whole part of Florida would have been extremely rural. A lot of small communities, smaller even than some of the small towns that we have near us in South Carolina, and those towns would have all been they all would have been segregated. There would have been a part of the town where our story takes place, where the African American residents would have lived and worked, and then there would be a white part of the town. Our central character, Delia, and remember she works as a washerwoman. She is the only character that we meet in the story who can cross over between the two worlds. Remember, she gets washed from the white families that she picks up on Saturday, and then she works through the week and returns it to them on Sunday. I guess the following Sunday. And she's able to move back and forth between those two parts of the town. The other characters that we meet largely would stay in the African American section of the town, and that's something I want us to focus on. Zora Neale Hurston, you may remember from the little introduction that our book gives us, in addition to being a writer, was also somebody who was trained as an anthropologist. So she is interested, and we find this in all of her works, not only in the stories of individual people, but she's interested in the societies and the worlds that those people live in. She likes to view towns and cities and communities almost like they're living things, like they're people. And when we look at this community, the one that our story takes place in, we'd see that it's really it's not doing well at all. Economically, it is struggling, and that would not be unusual for African American communities at this time. But there are also some other things that we should notice, and some of them are more absences than they are things that are present. Notice, for example, that there are no children anywhere in the story. Sykes and Delia, we know, and this maybe will give us some ties to the Steinbeck story that we just finished. Sykes and Delia have been married now for 14 years, and they don't have any children. Sykes is in a sexual relationship with Bertha, but we have no hope that relationship will produce children, and certainly it wouldn't. Uh, it, it's not presented to us as a healthy or wholesome relationship. The other characters that we meet, the who are principally the old men who are hanging around the store, they tend to be they're older. There's no talk about wives, no talk about families. This seems to be a society a little community that in some ways is dying, and it's dying from the inside out. What I want us to do, and this is what I'm going to ask you to do when we're discussing the story on Wednesday morning, is to think about all of the different things in the story that work as symbols, and almost everything does, and try to tie that to some of the issues that we'll be talking about, particularly things like race, gender, community, but also ideas of fertility uh, and sexuality, both uh, as a wholesome, life sustaining uh, enterprise, as one would think it could be in marriage, and also as something which is destructive to families, as it is with Sykes and Bertha. And what I want us to do is see if we can tie all of these various symbols that the author gives us in such a way that we can understand what Zora Neale Hurston is trying to tell us about these larger issues of community, gender, and race. Let's talk just a little bit, and I want to keep this video fairly short. Uh, that's what I've been told. Keep the videos to the students short because their attention span is short. I don't know. You guys pay attention for a whole hour when I'm talking to you, so maybe we can make it to 10 minutes. We'll see. Uh, Early in the story, remember that scene where Sykes comes in and he's got a bullwhip. Now, I want us to think a little bit as we're going through this story about the history of bullwhips, how they would have been used during a time of enslavement, and why it is somewhat ironic for Sykes, an African American man, to have that sign of oppression. But I also want us to think of the bullwhip as a symbol of his masculinity. And bear with me for a moment. Think about how traditionally masculinity is defined. Like, how does a man, and I'm not talking about the way that we actually work, but I'm thinking about, old understandings of gender roles. How do men come into rooms? They don't come in like Sykes, who's sneaking up behind his wife, almost like a child. That's not a manly entrance. And then he's got this bullwhip, and it's a sign of racial oppression. It also becomes a sign of his masculinity, uh, and he kind of dangles it to scare her. That's what his masculinity does. It's designed to frighten his wife. Uh, think again about the traditional signs of masculinity. What is it that husbands should be doing for their wives? Does Sykes actually do any of them? He's not a provider. He doesn't father any children. He doesn't really do much of anything. She's the breadwinner of the family. She's the one holding everything together. And he really is kind of just this appendage. The fact that he wants to use the sign of his masculinity, that whip, which is a uh, an instrument of violence. It's certainly not an instrument of love, and if it may have a phallic representation, but it's certainly not a representation of fertility. He wants to use it to frighten her. And think about in their marriage. Uh, he started. This is a story about an abusive relationship. It's the one story we'll read this semester that's about domestic violence. Sykes began beating his wife shortly after they were married. And I want us to use that idea of his masculinity being defined by this bullwhip that he kind of dangles pathetically over her shoulder, and the substitution that he has of violence as a sign of his power, rather than what we would think of as traditional signs of masculine power, whatever you decide those might be, and see if we can use that to connect other parts of the story. So the kinds of things I want you to be thinking about when we discuss it will be his relationship with Bertha. Hurston's going to call a lot of attention to the fact that Delia, his wife, is very thin. She works constantly, and whatever food is in the house is food that she would bring in. Bertha is described in contrast as being a large woman. Now, I want us to think about what Hurston might be telling us in that contrast between the two. And I think it has more that it's more significant than just Psyche's preference. There's something about Bertha being a large person and what that represents. And think about that scene when he's with her in the store and the way that he's talking so that all the other men can hear. What does she? How does she make him feel? How is Delia's small physical size? How does that become representative of everything that Sykes hates about their relationship, and maybe what he hates about himself and how he feels inadequate about himself? Okay, I'm just about at 11 minutes, and that's what the YouTube experts tell me I have to. That's my outer limit. So that's enough for us to think about. I'm looking forward to our discussion on Wednesday morning. Just one quick side note. So far, I've received one picture of a pet. Now, Milo is a cute puppy, and I'm happy to have a picture of Milo. But one picture I've gotten of a pet, and it's not even from your class. It's from my 300 level literature students. You folks can't let them win. Okay, talk to you Wednesday. Bye.